Hey fishing friend, my name is JC with radreelingfishing. In this video, we're going to talk about the different types of line and size of line that people use for sheepshead fishing. Yeah, you're not going to just use one size line, guys. It's a variable, and there's going to be some really good tips in this video. All right, you guys, so here's the deal. There are several different things that are going to affect the size line and type of line that we're using here. Number one is the structure and the type of structure that you're fishing around. Number two is the water clarity. Number three is how much current is there. And number four is the method that you are using to catch sheepshead. When I was down at the pier, I made like that video, right? From 3 different days fishing. One day there was a guy down there. One guy was fishing with 30-pound test monofilament leader or straight monofilament line. He caught more sheepshead than anybody else down there. Another guy, I asked him what pound test he was using. He was using 15-pound test leader line, but both guys were using 2 different methods. The one guy that was using 30-pound test leader line caught more sheepshead. The other guy caught sheepshead, just not as many. Let's talk about what's going on there. The guy with 30-pound test line, the method that he was using around all of those pilings is he was chumming those sheepshead, getting them in a crazy feeding frenzy, and then he would drop his bait down there right in the middle of the feeding frenzy with all these sheepshead, and they would grab his bait. So he's creating this competition between the fish. It's kind of like when you go to a pizza party, there's only 10 people and 3 pizzas are ordered, right? I'm the guy that wants to get to the pizza box first and get the type of pizza that I want and get as much of it as I can without being too rude, right? Well, yeah, there's competition around. So that's what's happening with that. So that's why that guy can get away with that really clear water down there. Oh yeah, it was super clear down there. He can get away with 30-pound tests because he's chumming the heck out of those sheepshead, and they're just crazy. They just all they want to do is eat. They're not looking at the line. The other guy had a mud crab. He was free lining a mud crab right down along the piling in hopes that a sheepshead would see that, or he would sight cast the sheepshead and the sheepshead would turn and look at that crab and follow it down. So when you've got one fish who is not competing with other fish looking at a crab that's drifting down, he might see that 30-pound test line. So that guy was fishing with 15-pound test. So here's the thing about when you're fishing around structure with sheepshead. 99% of the time, it's been my experience that sheepshead aren't the type of fish that they make long, hard runs like a snook or a redfish, and they try and get you all wrapped up in structure. Basically, when you hook a sheepshead, he stays straight in line with where you're reeling, depending on how powerful he is. And so if I'm fishing straight down and I hook a sheepshead, he's usually just doing this. He's coming up and he's weaving back and forth in an area that's at about 1.5 to 2 feet wide. And he just comes, you just reel him straight up, right? And then they make a run straight back down, and then they come back up as you're fighting that fish. They don't do a lot of running side to side and wrapping around pilings and stuff like that. So when you're fishing around structure, okay, you can get away with using a lighter leader line as long as you get your bait positioned correctly on the structure. Now, I mentioned that current affects what is happening. Now, the other day I made a video, 6 different ways to rig fishing with sheepshead. Sometimes you're gonna, I'll put a link down here in the description area. Sometimes you'll free line, sometimes you're gonna use a weight depending on the current, right? I also have a video that talks about all the different types of sheepshead baits that there are to use and some that are illegal to use in Florida. But positioning your bait next to the structure is important. So if you can see the structure you're fishing around, you always want to get your bait positioned so that when you set the hook, right, the fish is gonna be away from the structure. You're gonna be pulling that fish away from the structure. Now, sometimes those sheepshead will pick up the bait and run behind the piling and wrap you around. That happened to me the other day, and I ended up fighting a fish behind the piling. I was fighting that fish with 20-pound test leader. Generally, as a rule, I rig up with 25-pound test or 20-pound test leader. So here's the thing. If the water is super clear, right? Fishing is trial and error a lot of times. That's why I made that video of 6 different ways to rig for 6 different rigs that we use for sheepshead. Make sure you check that out, okay? But they're just variables that affect everything. So you're always trial and error, okay? So if you can't get a sheepshead to hit your bait on 25-pound test line, you might lead her down to 20. If you can't get them to hit on 20, you might lead her down to 15. But if you're using a chumming method like that guy, you might not have to worry about your leader line size. But it is so important to make sure that your bait is positioned where when you set the hook, that sheephead is not going to be like right up on the structure cutting you off. Now, there are other times when I fish out of the kayak when I'm fishing in the inlet, a lot of times that water is super clear, right? I have an area where I fish straight down and it's nothing but rocks. The sheepshead are just cruising back and forth looking for something to eat down there. I can get away with fishing with 15-pound test there when the water is super clear. I can set the hook really fast. I can set the hook and reel those fish up off of the bottom really quickly, as long as it's not like a giant fish. So if the water's super clear, I don't have a problem with leadering down to 15-pound test. If I get into some bigger fish and I start getting broken off, I'm going to switch over to 20 or 25-pound test. Also in that same inlet, when I am kayak fishing, right? There are docks over there where I fish around pilings. I can get away with fishing with 15-pound test if the current isn't moving really fast. But if the current is moving and swirling, I have to be using 25-pound test because that current is going to be moving my bait until I get a bite when I'm down there. And also when those fish are picking up that bait in the current, fish are moving around more when there's current. When there's not a lot of current, when they pick up the bait, they can pretty much stay stationary and eat it. But when they pick up a bait and they're in current, they have to move around. So there's a chance they might wrap around the piling. So you might be using a heavier pound test when you're fishing in heavier current. But here again, that depends on how you're rigging, right? When you're at a heavier current, you might be using a heavier weight to keep that positioned on right where you want it to be positioned around the structure. So there are a lot of variables that affect how you rig and the different pound test lines that you use when you're fishing for sheepshead. Now let's talk about the different types of lines, okay? You've got monofilament and fluorocarbon. Those are your two popular main lines or leader lines. A test was done that proved that monofilament is more abrasion resistant than fluorocarbon. I choose to use monofilament for that reason. And I also choose to use monofilament because it is a lot cheaper than fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon is so expensive. Now, the other question is, should you have your reel completely spooled up with monofilament, like all mainline, monofilament or fluorocarbon, or should you have your reel all spooled up with braided line? When I fish at the jetties, sometimes I will fish down there from shore and I will fish with straight 15-pound test or 20-pound test monofilament line. And the reason that I do that is because I get hung up so much. You're just casting out and there's rocks everywhere down there and you break off a lot. So I don't want to waste a lot of time having to tie on a monofilament leader to braided main line on my reel. So I will have just straight main monofilament line on my fishing reel because for that reason, okay? Other times I tie my leader line onto my braided line, and I always, when I'm tying my monofilament line onto my braided line, I'm always using like a 6 or 7 foot long leader. Unless I'm rigged with a fish finder rig, then I'm only going to use a shorter leader unless I'm using a swivel. But anyway, so there you go. Sometimes you'll fish with braided fishing line. Maybe you don't own a lot of fishing reel and rods like some people do. I mean, I've got quite a few of them because I've just accumulated them through the years over this channel, right? So I can afford to take one reel and spool it up completely with monofilament. Somebody might not be able to do that. So you might be stuck with fishing with just braided line and having tie on a monofilament leader. So I hope you're starting to see all of these different variables that are going to affect the type of line and the size of line that you're fishing with. I wish I could just tell you, hey, you always fish with 20 or 25-pound test line for sheepshead. But that's not the case. There are just too many variables. I mean, you might go to one place and you start out fishing with 25-pound test leader line. You're not getting any bites, right? So you switch over to 20-pound test or you drop down to 15. You just keep switching things up. That's why I made the video on the 6 different ways that you rig for sheepshead and all the different baits that you can use for sheepshead. So many different variables. I mean, I went down to that pier. One day I fished with shrimp. I could hardly get any hits. The next day I went down with mud crabs and we caught sheepshead. Another day I go down there and some guy is chumming the sheepshead like crazy and he catches more sheepshead than anybody else. So it's the different methods and the different variables that are going to determine whether we're catching sheepshead or not. And so there's all these different things that we have to look at as fishermen. So if you're a beginner, you guys, I wish I could just tell you, rig up with 25-pound test and always, use this type of bait and fish this method, but that's not the case, okay? But the thing is, majority of the time sheepshead are hanging around structure. So I can tell you that that's where you're going to find them most of the time. They're going to be hanging out around some type of structure. And obviously, if you have the ability to chum sheepshead, that's going to be the easiest way to get them to bite, is get them all fired up, chumming them with some type of chum. And I mean, we've seen guys chum sheepshead with shrimp. I've chummed them with shrimp before. You can chum them with sand fleas, chum them with barnacles, get them going really good. And then when you do that, it basically doesn't even matter what you're dropping down there. Those fish are going to eat what you're dropping down there. All right, guys. Well, I hope you've learned something here. Like I said, I'll put a link in this video to the 6 different types of rigs that you can use and all the different types of bait that people use for sheepshead fishing. Make sure that you go check those out. Thumbs up are appreciated. Get out there and go fishing, man. Life is fun. Live it. See ya.